The transmission hit the Galactic Council chamber, while the ambassadors were still arguing over tariff corridors. And for 3 full seconds, nobody spoke. Because the sound coming through the speakers was not language, not politics, not even war. It was children screaming under decompression alarms, while a human teacher kept saying with impossible calm, "Stay low, hands over your ears, keep your eyes on me." Right up until the hull split and the recording dissolved into static. By the time the footage finished, 87 seats had turned toward the Terran delegation, and every single faceted eye in the chamber knew what it meant. The vessel had been under truce seal. Its beacon was transmitting civilian registry, school convoy, emergency corridor, no military escort, no concealed weapons. There were 612 children aboard, ranging from 7 to 14 standard years, all of them being evacuated from the outer colonies after Terran raiders had begun burning agricultural moons near Sol's trade edge. The convoy had asked for passage. Passage had been granted under council law. Then, 3 Terran cruisers had dropped from dark space, locked weapons anyway, and carved the ship open as if interstellar law were a joke told for weaker species. The Terran ambassador did what empires always do when they believe themselves untouchable. He rose slowly, adjusted the silver torque around his throat, and said the footage was regrettable, that unfortunate errors occurred near unstable frontiers, that humans should not have stationed their young so close to disputed space, that the Empire would investigate if the Council insisted on preserving decorum. Then, because arrogance always reaches for one insult too many, he added that species who bred so emotionally should never have entered galactic affairs. Across the chamber, the Terran representative did not stand. Ambassador Elia Vance remained seated, hands folded on the table, her face still and almost empty. That stillness frightened the older powers more than rage would have. The Volari knew it first. The Seleth knew it second. The council speaker knew it when he saw Vance looking not at the Terran, but at the empty places in the room where the dead should have been. She asked for one thing only. She requested, in a voice so flat it seemed to scrape the stone, that the Terran Empire immediately surrender the captains responsible, open their military archives, and submit their border fleets to inspection under Article 9 of the Civilian Protections Compact. The Terran laughed. Not all of them, just the ambassador. But one laugh was enough. He called the demand theatrical. He reminded the chamber that the Terran Empire controlled 41 systems, 6 gate lanes, and the largest antimatter reserve outside the core. He said no empire in recorded history had ever bowed to a newcomer over the deaths of a few hundred offspring. He said the council would not risk war over human sentiment. That was the moment the line was crossed for the second time. The first crossing had happened in vacuum, in blood and torn metal, and a child's last cry cut short by the black. The second happened in law, under lights and cameras and the witness of 1,000 worlds. The Terran had not merely killed Earth's children. They had announced, before the galaxy, that they believed humanity lacked the will to answer. Ambassador Vance finally stood. The chamber expected a threat. They expected grief. Perhaps they expected tears, because older species often mistook softness of face for softness of nerve. Instead, Vance touched the small black pin on her collar, an old Terran symbol, a downward torch, and said, "The Terran Union withdraws its petition for arbitration." The speaker blinked. "Ambassador, if you reject arbitration, then this dispute is no longer a dispute," Vance said. The chamber fell colder. She turned to the council recorders. Let the record show that humanity sought remedy in law. Let the record show that the Quran Empire rejected that law before witnesses. Let the record show that from this moment onward, the Terran Union recognizes a state of moral extinction between our peoples. The phrase meant nothing to most of the chamber. It meant everything to the few historians old enough to remember prohibited human archives from before Saul had joined the stars. The Volari delegate actually made a warding gesture. The Seleth military observer opened a private emergency line. The Quran ambassador, still smiling, asked what exactly moral extinction was supposed to mean. Vance looked at him with eyes like dark iron. It means, she said, you are about to learn why humanity has so many rules. She left without another word. The first Quran response was predictable. They celebrated. Imperial state channels mocked the human withdrawal as wounded theatrics. Quran admirals declared the Terrans too young, too divided, and too idealistic to fight a total war. Their analysts counted ship tonnage, gate access, colonial dependence, and supply depth, then concluded that if conflict came at all, it would end with Earth forced into a humiliating treaty and permanent tribute rights. Human restraint had been mistaken for fragility for so long that the Quran could no longer see the difference between patience and fear. Then Sol went silent. Not in panic, not in chaos, in order. Terran merchant traffic vanished from the trade lattice within 6 hours. Civilian channels narrowed to emergency bandwidth. Every embassy light in human space went dark except one. And from that one tower over the Pacific arcology, a single message was sent to every capital, fleet anchor, and listening post in known space. It was short enough to fit in a tactical burst. Terran civilian dead acknowledged. Memorial protocol active. Do not interfere. 3 governments immediately demanded clarification. 12 quietly moved their border patrols farther from human lanes. The Volari Senate sealed its schools. The council convened an emergency night session and discovered that every human observer, clerk, translator, and attaché had already departed the station, down to the last janitorial subcontractor. They had left the coffee warm. On the 7th hour, the Terran lost Gate Lorne. Lorne was not a colony. It was an artery, a relay fortress built into an artificial moon, armored with layered shields and ringed by enough weapons to crack continents. It controlled the main corridor between the Terran interior and their frontier conquests. It also sat well behind their defensive grid, protected by mine veils, patrol rotations, and quantum sentries that were supposed to detect any mass transition within 2 light minutes. At 3:14 station time, every external camera on Lorne went white. Not from an explosion, from reflected engine flare. The object that emerged from dark space did so inside the perimeter, on a vector no known fleet should have been able to calculate. It was not a ship in the conventional sense, but a black spear of hull and heat haze, longer than a battlecruiser, stripped of insignia, its profile so clean it looked unfinished. Lorne fired on reflex. Its guns tracked air. Its missiles chased ghosts. The spear never answered, never broadcast, never altered course. It drove straight through the central shield harmonics, broke the fortress spine with kinetic impact alone, then vanished into another impossible transition before the debris finished rotating. A minute later, every Terran command node in 5 sectors began receiving the same transmission on emergency military frequencies. No image, no anthem, no code challenge, just a human voice reciting names. Not the names of the dead children, the names of the adults responsible. Captains, sensor officers, ministers, logistics controllers, legal clerks who had overridden truce recognition, admirals who had approved rules of engagement, and finally, the name of the Terran ambassador himself. After each name came the same phrase: confirmed, counted, pending. Panic did not spread at once. Empires are too proud for that. First came denial, then fury, then the ordering of fleets. The Terran High War Nest mobilized 3 carrier groups, 5 interdiction screens, and a punitive expedition aimed at the human colonies nearest the frontier. Their intention was simple: crush the upstart before the story changed shape. Burn 2 or 3 worlds. Force Earth to negotiate from its knees. They issued public declarations promising corrective action against piratical Terran reprisals, and privately instructed their admirals to target shipyards, food depots, schools, and memory vaults. If humans cared so much about children, the Terran reasoned, then terror would work on them better than battle. It was an old logic. It had broken older empires than theirs. The punitive expedition never reached human space. At the Narrows of Ith, one of the narrowest superluminal corridors in the Arm, the Terran vanguard encountered what their scouts described as sensor contamination. The corridor ahead appeared full of civilian traffic, medical vessels, derelict cargo tins, and scattered transmission ghosts from a dozen languages. Terran doctrine required aggressive advance. They pushed through. The debris field detonated into precision war. Every civilian silhouette had been a masked drone seated with singularity flechettes. Every garbled distress call was a targeting lure. Every dead channel had been measured so exactly that the moment the Terran shields flared, buried weapons in the corridor walls woke up and struck from pre-positioned stealth coffins laid months, maybe years, before the crisis. Human ships emerged only after the ambush was already decided. They came in disciplined wedges without banners, cold gray and lightless, launching no challenges, wasting no ammunition. They fired through the gaps the traps created. They cut drives, command decks, and fuel veins. They left escape pods drifting untouched. By the time the Terran rear group realized it had sailed into a prepared kill geometry, the front half of the fleet was a rotating graveyard. Survivors brought back the first phrase that began to haunt military channels across the galaxy. The humans had called the trap a contingency, not a desperate maneuver, not an improvisation, a contingency. More revelations followed. Human merchant hulls, long dismissed as over-engineered and needlessly sturdy, were discovered to contain modular combat cores. Civilian traffic algorithms turned out to be wartime logistics maps. Deep space weather buoys were actually dormant sensor lances networked across half a spiral arm. Colony tugs became missile barges. Ice haulers became armor tenders. Rescue ships began retrieving alien civilians from battle zones, even while Terran strike groups annihilated the military assets around them. It was like watching an entire species peel away a peaceful outer skin and reveal that every institution beneath it had been built with war in mind. The Council finally understood the terrible implication. Humanity had not become dangerous in response to the massacre. Humanity had been dangerous all along, and had spent generations burying that fact under treaties, trade, culture, and manners, because they preferred a galaxy in which they would never need to prove it. The hidden doctrine had a name, and when it leaked, the oldest archives shuddered. Memorial War. It came from Earth's pre-interstellar history, from an era when human nations had discovered that some acts did not end with punishment, deterrence, or negotiated peace. Some acts entered a colder category. If children were deliberately targeted under protection, if law was mocked after appeal, if the aggressor showed neither remorse nor surrender, then the objective changed. Humanity would no longer seek victory. It would seek permanent impossibility. The offending power would be reduced beyond revenge, beyond recovery, beyond myth if necessary. Not merely beaten, rendered incapable of ever having done it again. The council speaker transmitted urgent requests for de-escalation. No answer came from Earth, only movement. Terran fleets had been spotted before, of course. Patrol walls, carrier escorts, survey groups. What emerged now was something else. The first Terran fleet entered public awareness over Vesta Dock, and even then it was only one of many. Kilometers of dark hull slid from hidden cradles under rock and ice, line after line, silent except for the hum of drives powerful enough to bend local sensor arrays. There were no decorative fins, no imperial gold, no ceremonial gun decks. Human war design had the blunt honesty of an executioner's tools. Everything unnecessary had been stripped away centuries ago. Every vessel looked built for one thing and utterly certain of it. Then came the ships the human records had never mentioned. Grave-class archive ships, armored data vaults with battlefield communications arrays large enough to rewrite local networks by force. Blackwater interdiction cruisers capable of collapsing gate mouths without destroying the gates. Quiet carriers that launched no fighters because their weapons were swarms of autonomous killcraft too small for standard tracking. And at the center of one formation, visible for only 26 seconds before vanishing from every amateur feed by legal order, a vessel so vast, the news channels argued over whether the image had been faked. It carried the name TNS Quiet Earth. No one in the council needed confirmation of what a ship like that was built to do. The Terran needed none either. At last, true doubt began to infect them. They appealed to allies. None answered. They invoked trade obligations. Contracts were suspended. They accused humanity of destabilizing civilization. Civilizations that had watched their children die on open channel were no longer interested in lectures. Worse, evidence kept emerging. Human intelligence releases, meticulous, time-stamped, indisputable, showed that the school convoy attack had not been a border error at all. It had been deliberate policy. Terran Frontier Command had identified the convoy as civilian, debated its symbolic value, and destroyed it specifically to test whether humans would accept humiliation. One line from a captured admiral spread across the networks like poison. They are a young species. Break the young, and the adults obey. After that, even species that feared Terran retaliation more than they trusted human virtue stopped pleading for restraint. They started asking how far the Terrans intended to go. The answer arrived at Terran Prime, not as bombardment. That would have been mercy, and too public. Instead, humanity opened the war in layers. Terran cyberwar teams erased the outer ministries first, shutting archives, falsifying fleet recalls, turning internal command traffic into contradiction and noise. Blackwater cruisers folded the gate mouths inward, isolating whole sectors from one another. Stealth teams severed antimatter refineries without detonating them, starving the war machine instead of feeding its martyrdom. Precision strikes removed military academies, naval colleges, dockyards, weapons laboratories, and breeding vaults reserved for officer castes. Human Marines boarded the worlds they could have glassed and took them room by room, because they were still distinguishing between guilty and merely ruled. That distinction was another thing the Terran had never understood. Humanity was not enraged into madness. Humanity was disciplined by grief. Where Terran commanders hid under hospitals, humans cut the power to the command bunkers beneath and extracted the civilians above. Where Imperial fleets used refugee streams as cover, Terran formations opened corridors through their own firing lines to let civilian ships escape. More than once, Terran gunners fired on their own population, trying to flee worlds the Empire no longer controlled. More than once, human ships shielded those same civilians from the fire. Survivor testimony began changing the political weather faster than any propaganda. The Empire called humans monsters. Millions of Terran civilians had been saved by those monsters and knew exactly who had murdered them. Still, the High War Nest refused surrender. Pride can keep a regime breathing long after reason would have let it die. The Nest retreated to the Hall of Ancestral Flame, their oldest fortress palace carved into the red mantle cliffs above Terran Prime's equator. It was symbol and bunker both, armored against siege, fed by deep geothermal veins, guarded by fanatics. From there, the High Sovereign finally issued a message to Earth. He offered partial reparations, blamed rogue admirals, and demanded an immediate ceasefire. He never mentioned the children. Earth answered with a single encrypted packet routed through the Council for Legal Record. It contained the names of all 612 dead children. At the bottom was one sentence: "You were counted first." The final campaign lasted 9 days. Across those days, the Terrans demonstrated the last measure of what they had been hiding. Until then, the galaxy had seen superior planning, logistical depth, strategic patience, and terrifying industrial disguise. It had not yet seen how far human resolve extended when every appeal had failed. The Terran fortress rings around Prime were defended by layered stellar shields tied to orbital mass anchors. Standard doctrine held that such a lattice could only be reduced by weeks of attrition or a starbreaker event that would devastate the planet below. The Terrans did neither. They deployed the quiet Earth. No public sensor package captured the mechanism clearly. What the surviving records show is this: the great ship took position beyond the moon line, its hull opening in concentric petals like a machine flower built by something that hated beauty. Space around it bent, not tore, bent. A focused gravitic lens formed across 20,000 kilometers of vacuum, and then, with impossible delicacy, pressed against the shield lattice at its harmonic seams. One by one, the orbital anchors slipped out of phase. Not exploded, disengaged. The fortress rings began to drift apart under their own differential stress. Terran fleets moved through the gaps in absolute silence. It was a weapon designed by minds that had spent centuries asking not how to destroy, but how to remove. Terran admirals finally broke. Some fled into deep black and were hunted. Some scuttled their ships and begged asylum. Some attempted martyr strikes against Earth and discovered that human defense grids had expected them months in advance. One carrier group jumped toward Sol and emerged inside a mine geometry so old its beacon signatures still carried maintenance codes from peacetime survey authorities. Every ship was dead before its commanders understood they had been lured through a lane humans had left open on purpose. At the Hall of Ancestral Flame, the High Sovereign watched his command map collapse sector by sector. The Terrans were in the lower mantle transit shafts. They were in the sky forts above the capital. They were in the state archive towers, securing records. They were in the memorial gardens, evacuating caretakers before the fighting reached them. They were in his palace walls. He sent one last message to the council, screaming now, no longer regal. He called the humans exterminators. He demanded intervention. He claimed genocide. The council did something it had almost never done. It refused him. Because by then, the evidence was complete. Humanity was not killing indiscriminately. Humanity was dismantling a regime with surgical hatred and historical intent. Civilian casualties under Terran occupation were lower than under Terran internal security in the final days of the Empire. Food was being distributed by the same species Terran propaganda called beasts. Medical ships marked with the blue cradle of Earth were operating in cities whose orbital defense guns had fired on them hours before. The contrast was too stark to survive spin. Then the Terrans entered the ancestral archive. That was where the Terran believed themselves immortal. Their history was encoded there in crystal stacks, bloodline songs, victory walls, conqueror lists stretching back 14,000 years. Names were sacred to them. Names were continuity. Names were proof that what they had done would echo forever. The Terrans took the archive intact. They copied everything. Then they did something so cold the galaxy still speaks of it in lowered voices. After the High War Nest surrendered, after the military chains were broken, after civilian governance had been transferred to protected provisional councils, the Terran Union filed its final legal declaration before the Galactic Council. It presented the massacre evidence, the rejected arbitration, the deliberate policy records, the war crimes, and the surrender terms. Then it invoked a measure no one had ever seen used, because no one had realized any civilization would think to write it. Article 0 of the Founding Accords. A dormant clause proposed long ago by humanity during accession and dismissed at the time as philosophical melodrama, recognized a right of collective historical severance against powers guilty of protected child slaughter under truce seal and unrepentant after lawful demand. The Council had laughed when humans insisted on including it. Now, the law was active. The sentence was not species death. The surviving Terran civilians would live under new names, new governance, and monitored demilitarization. Children would be educated. Refugees would be resettled. Genetic lines would continue if they chose. Humanity did not wipe out a people. It did something the galaxy found, in some ways, more terrible. It killed the Empire so completely that its name was forbidden. All official records identifying the ruling species, the imperial title, the dynastic houses, the conquest banners, and the ancestral victory nomenclature were sealed, redacted, or replaced with a blank legal marker, translated in most languages as null. Their monuments were preserved, but unlabeled. Their fleets were museum wreckage without inscriptions. Their language survived in scholarship, but the imperial self-name was excised from maps, statutes, trade logs, and military histories. Even the council chamber seat was listed only as vacated by null power, per Article 0 enforcement. The surviving civilians asked why. Ambassador Vance, returning to the chamber months later wearing the same black pin, answered for the record. Because they wanted to teach the galaxy that children can be murdered without consequence if the murderer is powerful enough. We have chosen to teach the galaxy the opposite. They will be remembered only as the civilization that proved this law was necessary. Nothing else about them deserves immortality. No one objected. Not the Volari, not the Sileth, not even the species that had once traded eagerly with the Empire. The footage of the school convoy still existed in sealed judicial archives, and on certain memorial days, the sound of decompression alarms still rolled across public plazas from Sol to the outer reach. There are moments a civilization cannot out-argue, only answer. Years later, travelers to the former Terran worlds found schools rebuilt under open skies. They found children of many kinds learning side by side in cities no longer lined with military castes. They found human advisors present but never celebrated, Terran fleet stations in deep orbit, and nowhere visible from the playgrounds. They found memorial stones carved with 612 names in Terran script and local translation. At the bottom of each stone were the same words: counted, remembered, never again. And everywhere else in the galaxy, empires grew suddenly polite where human civilians were concerned. Convoys under truce seal passed untouched. Refugee ships received escorts. War colleges rewrote their doctrines around a lesson no admiral wanted to test. Humanity could endure insult. It could endure exclusion. It could endure condescension, cheating, sanctions, border pressure, and the smug laughter of older thrones. It would argue in chambers, sign in good faith, and offer law before violence as many times as reason required. But if you murdered Earth's children and called it strategy, humanity would not merely come for your fleets. It would come for your future, your symbols, your victories, your blood-soaked myths, and the very word by which history knew you. And when it was done, there would be no empire left to mourn, only a blank where a name used to be.